Fairy tales sold us magic, destiny, and charming little lessons for children. History sold the uncut version: disease, massacres, kidnappings, child labor, starvation, and people doing things so insane they sound invented. Today, we're exposing 33 fairy tales and childhood classics that were hiding horrifying real events under the prettiest possible packaging. 1. Sleeping Beauty gets a lot less dreamy when you realize history produced its own real cursed sleep. In the early 20th century, encephalitis lethargica swept through parts of the world and left victims trapped in bodies that barely moved. Some patients seemed awake, but frozen. Unable to speak normally, unable to move normally, like the person was still there, but the controls had been stolen by the universe. Doctors and relatives described them as living statues, which is somehow even more horrifying than anything involving a spindle. Later cases showed people whose lives had effectively been paused for years, or even decades, which makes the fairy tale version look like a brutally sanitized rewrite. The castle sleeps for 100 years, real patients were forced into a waking prison, and nobody showed up with magic lips to fix it. Turns out the original Do Not Disturb sign was written by neurology and pure nightmare fuel. 2. Red Riding Hood feels much less like a moral fable when you place it next to the Beast of Gévaudan, the real predator panic that tore through 18th century France. Between 1764 and 1767, more than 100 people were reportedly killed in attacks blamed on a terrifying creature described as wolf-like but not quite right, bigger, stranger, and somehow more theatrical in its appetite for chaos. It targeted women and children often enough that entire communities lived in constant dread, which gives the whole girl walking through the woods set up a very ugly historical echo. The hunts became so famous that the Crown got involved, and the story spread like an international horror franchise before horror franchises were even invented. Whether it was one beast, several animals, or a case of panic piling onto panic, the fear was real and the blood was real. So yes, Watch Out for the Wolf was not just storytelling. It was basically the local version of a public safety announcement with teeth. 3. Snow White has one of those origins historians love arguing over, but one of the darkest theories points to Margaretha von Waldeck, a 16th century German noblewoman who died young amid rumors of poisoning. That alone already sounds suspiciously grim, but the really disturbing layer is the mining world around her family, because later writers linked the dwarfs to child laborers working in copper mines. These children often suffered stunted growth, deformities, and bodies wrecked by brutal conditions, toxic exposure, and the kind of labor system that makes modern office jobs look like a spa retreat. Is this a proven one-to-one source for Snow White? No, it is a theory, and it should be presented that way. But once you hear it, the cheerful cottage in the woods starts looking less like cute fantasy and more like industrial misery with a singing bird soundtrack pasted on top. Nothing says bedtime story quite like aristocratic poisoning and children being crushed by capitalism before capitalism even got its full logo. 4. Take away the giant, the beanstalk, and the heroic music, and Jack and the Beanstalk starts looking like folklore's most successful home invasion. In many older versions, Jack sneaks into someone else's house, accepts help from the giant's wife, steals valuables, comes back for more, and eventually kills the homeowner when the homeowner has the audacity to dislike being robbed repeatedly. That is not heroic destiny. That is escalating criminal behavior with suspiciously good public relations. Later versions got nervous about this and tried to retrofit a justification by claiming the giant had wronged Jack's father, which is basically the fairy tale version of a lawyer rushing into the room and shouting, "Your Honor, context." Without that patch, Jack is less a brave underdog and more a cheerful burglar who treats homicide like a productivity hack. The story only works because folklore often admires survival, even when survival is wearing a ski mask. Jack did not beat the system, he just rebranded banditry as ambition and somehow got children's merch out of it. 5. Alice in Wonderland feels much less charming once you remember that Mad as a Hatter was not random nonsense, but a real occupational nightmare. Victorian hat makers often worked with mercury compounds, especially mercuric nitrate, in hot, poorly ventilated spaces, and long exposure could cause tremors, mood swings, slurred speech, memory problems, and behavior that looked bizarre or unstable. So the Mad Hatter is not just whimsical chaos in a top hat. He is standing on the edge of a very real industrial health disaster. Suddenly, the Tea Party starts looking less like literary nonsense and more like a factory accident that learned table manners. It is one of those classic 19th century moves where society wanted stylish accessories but did not particularly care if the workers making them had functioning nervous systems by age 40. Wonderland feels surreal because the real world feeding it was already half surreal. Apparently, the price of a fashionable hat was some neurological damage, which is an absolutely insane sentence to put on a product label. 6. The Lion King gets much more impressive and much darker when you connect it to the epic tradition around Sundiata Keita, the founder of the Mali Empire. In that tradition, Sundiata was a prince mocked for physical weakness in childhood, a boy who struggled to walk, then survived family catastrophe, exile, and political treachery before returning to defeat the feared ruler Sumaoro Kante and reclaim power. He was remembered as the Lion of Mali, which means history had already done the branding work centuries before animation arrived. The parallels are hard to miss: the threatened royal line, the exiled heir, the usurper, the triumphant return, the restoration of order. The difference is that the real version comes with empire, warfare, dynastic violence, and actual state building instead of comic relief and catchy songs. There is no adorable sidekick package in the historical material, only power, survival, and the brutal fact that thrones attract murder like picnic tables attract ants. Real medieval politics was basically a Disney plot with fewer jokes and infinitely worse dental care. 7. Humpty Dumpty was not originally an egg, at least not in one of the most famous historical theories, which immediately makes the whole thing funnier and more ridiculous. According to the canon theory, Humpty Dumpty was a massive royalist gun placed on a wall during the English Civil War at Colchester in 1648. The wall was damaged, the cannon fell, and all the king's horses and all the king's men could not haul the thing back into action, which helped doom the defense. Now, to be fair, this is a later theory rather than a proven origin, but you can see why people love it. It transforms a silly nursery rhyme into a neat little memory of battlefield failure and royal embarrassment, which is catnip for folklore. The image is incredible too, because instead of a fragile egg, you get a huge metal weapon face-planting into mud, while an entire side of a war apparently discovers that heavy objects are, in fact, heavy. Humpty Dumpty was not delicate, he was just logistically inconvenient. 8. Goldilocks began in a much nastier form than the polished children's version most people know. In early tellings, the intruder is not a cute blonde child with oops energy, but a rude, ugly old vagabond who barges into someone else's house, eats their food, breaks their things, and behaves like basic human boundaries are a personal insult. That shift matters because the original figure reflects a social fear that ran deep in 19th century culture. The outsider, the wanderer, the poor stranger who crosses into domestic space and brings disorder with her. The tale is basically a home security pamphlet disguised as folklore. Later versions softened her into a child, because apparently audiences respond better when the trespassing criminal is marketable and can be drawn with ringlets. But the skeleton of the story never changed. Someone enters your private world uninvited and leaves chaos behind. It is porridge, chairs, and beds on the surface, but underneath it is pure middle-class panic wearing a bedtime story smile. 9. Bluebeard becomes much uglier once you connect him to Gilles de Rais, the French nobleman and former companion of Joan of Arc, who later became infamous for the murder of children. He had wealth, status, military glory, and the kind of social protection that lets monsters look impressive from a distance, which is exactly why the Bluebeard comparison stuck so hard. The core terror of the tale is not really the beard or the keys or the forbidden room. It is the idea that power can hide atrocity behind etiquette and silk curtains. History is full of men who were treated like pillars of society right up until the cellar door finally swung open. Whether Gilles directly is Bluebeard in some perfectly clean literary sense is debatable, but the emotional logic is obvious. The story works because people know respectable evil is often more dangerous than obvious evil. A villain in black armor is easy. A villain with a title, a fortune, and excellent table manners is where history starts sweating. 10. The Three Little Pigs is usually sold as a neat little lesson about hard work, but it also lands with a nasty historical echo when you think about the Highland clearances. In Scotland, landlords forced tenants off the land, destroyed fragile homes, and shattered old communities in the name of improvement, which is one of history's most polished words for behaving like a complete menace. So when a huge destructive force shows up and turns weak homes into wreckage, people do not need much imagination to hear something more brutal than a talking wolf. To be clear, the tale is not a proven allegory of the clearances, and it should not be presented that way. But the resonance is real, because poor families absolutely did live in vulnerable houses, while powerful men decided those lives were negotiable. The pig with the brick house is not just practical, he is basically the only tenant who managed to hire a lawyer, a surveyor, and maybe a miracle before the landlord arrived. 11. Cinderella was glamorous long before the glass slipper got polished by later Europe, because one of the earliest known versions traces back to ancient Egypt and the story of Rhodopis. She was a Greek slave living in Egypt, and in the classic account, an eagle snatched one of her sandals and dropped it before the king, who became determined to find the woman it belonged to. That is already Cinderella with the serial numbers only half filed off. The dark part, of course, is that the fantasy starts from enslavement, not from charming inconvenience. Her elevation only feels miraculous because her starting point is total powerlessness inside a system built to treat people like movable property. Fairy tales love sudden rescue because ordinary reality was usually too ugly to sell without some divine weirdness attached. So yes, the famous romantic arc may have ancient roots, but those roots are growing in slave society. Nothing says magical destiny like a giant bird becoming more useful to your freedom than the entire legal system around you. 12. Hansel and Gretel becomes almost unbearable once you place it against the Great Famine of 1315, when Europe was hammered by crop failures, relentless rain, livestock collapse, disease, and hunger so severe that normal moral life started coming apart at the seams. Contemporary reports and later historians describe abandonment of children, infanticide, and even cannibalism in some places, because starvation does not politely damage society, it grabs it by the throat and shakes until the mask falls off. That is why the story of desperate parents leaving children in the woods feels so chillingly plausible. It is not just a spooky setup, it is famine logic, the cruel mathematics of too little food and too much despair. Even the edible house becomes darker in that context, because when people are starving, fantasy itself starts tasting like bread. The tale survives because it knows a terrible truth. Hunger turns home into a battlefield, parents into strangers, and morality into a luxury item nobody can afford. 13. Baba Yaga's hut on chicken legs sounds wonderfully insane until you look at old Slavic and northern building traditions and realize folklore probably started with something very practical. Scholars often connect the image to raised structures built on stilts, tree stumps, or elevated supports that protected food stores from dampness, animals, and thieves. And in some interpretations, similar forms were linked to mortuary traditions as well. Suddenly, the famous hut stops looking like pure fantasy and starts looking like reality. After several generations of storytellers decided reality was not creepy enough on its own. That is exactly how folklore works. It steals one real object, feeds it mushrooms, then lets it sprint into the woods screaming. The raised hut already had everything a legend needed: isolation, strangeness, and a shape that looks disturbingly alive in the wrong light. Add a witch, a mortar, and some casual child-eating energy, and congratulations, architecture has become nightmare content. Human beings have always had a remarkable talent for seeing a storage solution and thinking, yes, but what if it also cursed your bloodline? 14. The Wizard of Oz gets darker when people read the flying monkeys as reflecting the fate of indigenous peoples, especially because L. Frank Baum himself wrote openly violent newspaper editorials calling for the destruction of Native Americans. In the book, the monkeys are not naturally evil monsters. They are a people forced into service through the golden cap and manipulated by whoever controls it, especially the Wicked Witch. That does not prove a neat one-to-one code where monkeys equal this exact group, and it should not be oversold. But once you place the story beside Baum's real political language, the image of a native population being enslaved, commanded, and used by outside power starts looking a lot less innocent. Oz is often remembered for bright fantasy, yet parts of it are built over very dark American realities. The monkeys are funny only until you realize the joke may be standing on top of conquest, displacement, and the usual national hobby of turning other people's suffering into scenery. 15. Beauty and the Beast turns quietly tragic when you connect it to Petrus Gonsalves, a 16th-century man with hypertrichosis whose body was covered in hair and whose life was spent under the gaze of European courts. He was educated, dressed in noble clothing, married, and displayed as an object of fascination, which is a very elegant way for aristocrats to say, "We have trapped a human being inside our curiosity cabinet." Several of his children were also documented and portrayed because apparently one person's dignity was not enough for the elite to interfere with. That is why the connection to Beauty and the Beast still hits, because beneath the romantic frame sits a real history of people being treated as wonders, specimens, or entertainment rather than as full human beings. The fairy tale offers the fantasy that love sees past the exterior. The real world usually preferred to stare at the exterior, commission a portrait of it, and then congratulate itself for being sophisticated. Court culture was often just a freak show with better upholstery and more Latin. 16. Robin Hood makes much more sense when you remember how brutal medieval English forest law could be. Royal forests were not simply nice green areas with deer and birdsong. They were heavily protected hunting zones where common people could face savage punishments for taking the king's game. In some periods and descriptions, penalties for poaching included mutilation such as blinding or castration, which means the state was fully prepared to destroy a person's body over the unauthorized pursuit of dinner. Once you know that, the outlaw in the green hood stops looking like a cute folk rebel and starts looking like the inevitable result of a legal system that treated aristocratic leisure as more sacred than peasant survival. No wonder the forest became the natural stage for resistance, because the law itself was already behaving like a villain with a crown. Robin Hood is popular because everyone understands, on some very basic human level, that if the law protects deer more fiercely than starving people, the law deserves to have its pockets checked. 17. Aladdin is one of the strangest cultural mashups in literary history, which is fitting for a story about magic because its own passport situation is a mess. The version known to most of the world was not part of the earliest Arabic manuscript tradition of the 1001 Nights, but entered through Antoine Galland after he heard it from the Syrian storyteller Hannah Diab in Paris. So one of the most famous Arabian tales owes an enormous amount to a real Syrian traveler whose role was long underappreciated. Then the story itself claims to be set in China, yet everything in it feels gloriously confused, with sultans, viziers, Islamic flavor, and Middle Eastern social texture wandering around as if geography was merely a polite suggestion. It is basically global folklore doing improv with no map and outrageous confidence. So yes, Aladdin is magical, but the real magic trick is how a Syrian-told, French-transmitted, pseudo-Chinese story became everybody's default fantasy of the East without even breaking a sweat. 18. Mother Goose sounds harmless until you notice how closely the figure overlaps with long-standing witch stereotypes in European culture. Older women with odd hats, sharp profiles, animal companions, and an aura of suspicious folk knowledge were exactly the kind of imagery societies had already loaded with fear during the age of witch hunts. That matters because those stereotypes were not just artistic quirks. They fed into real persecution, torture, and execution across Europe, where tens of thousands were killed and many more accused. So the eerie part is not that Mother Goose told nursery rhymes. It is that a children's storytelling mascot could inherit so much visual baggage from a machinery of paranoia and punishment. History loves laundering its ugliest patterns by repainting them in cozy colors and putting them next to a cradle. The old woman once marked as threatening, irrational, and suspect becomes a harmless grandmother figure. But the bones of the stereotype are still showing through the wallpaper. Childhood culture has a weird habit of adopting yesterday's terror and giving it a cute hat. 19. The Pied Piper of Hamelin is disturbing because the oldest core of the story may preserve a real collective trauma, rather than just a clever invention. Hamelin's own records refer to 130 children leaving the town in 1284 and never returning. And centuries later, scholars still argue over what actually happened. Some theories say they were recruited for migration eastward. Others suggest disease, social upheaval, or a disaster later transformed into legend. The rats, interestingly, appear to be a later addition, which means the original emotional engine of the story was not pest control, but disappearance. That makes the tale much uglier, because beneath the colorful piper and the memorable tune is a community remembering the moment its young people went out and did not come home. Folklore often adds spectacle because plain grief is too heavy to carry naked. When a town needs a flute-playing stranger to explain a historical wound, you know reality already did something nasty enough that facts alone were not emotionally sufficient. 20. The Little Engine. That could sound wholesome until you place it in the ideological weather of early 20th century industrial America, where perseverance was not just a virtue but practically a national religion. On the surface, it is a cheerful little story about confidence and effort, with a tiny engine pushing through difficulty by repeating a motivational phrase. Wonderful, inspirational. Print it on a classroom wall immediately. But in a society obsessed with productivity, duty, grit, and pushing past fatigue, the message starts looking much less innocent. The engine wins by ignoring strain and hauling the load anyway, which is exactly the kind of lesson industrial capitalism adored handing to workers whose bodies were expected to keep going long after comfort had left the building. This reading is interpretive rather than a documented secret confession from the author, but the overlap is hard to ignore. I Think I Can is adorable until it becomes the soundtrack of a culture politely asking everybody to burn out with enthusiasm. 21. The Princess and the Frog was not originally solved with a sweet, redeeming kiss, because older versions had much less patience for romance and much more enthusiasm for blunt impact. In the grim telling, the princess becomes so disgusted by the frog that she throws him against the wall, and that violent shock is what breaks the spell, which is a spectacularly unhinged solution if you grew up on sanitized adaptations, because it turns the whole fairy tale into a lesson in magical assault management. Yet that weird brutality fits a world where medicine, discipline, and correction were often imagined in physical terms, as if transformation required smashing, purging, or forcing the body through pain until it submitted. The later kiss is public relations. The wall was the original treatment plan. Suddenly, the story sounds less like true love and more like medieval therapy, designed by someone who thought bedside manner was a sign of weakness. Apparently, one of Europe's great romantic breakthroughs began with the emotional maturity of hurling a wet problem at masonry. 22. The shoemaker and the elves look sweet until you notice what the fantasy actually delivers. Invisible workers producing perfect goods overnight while the owner wakes up richer and more successful. Strictly speaking, the story is older than the Victorian age, so it is not literally a coded report from 19th century sweatshops. But once the industrial world arrives, the tale develops a nasty aftertaste because real children were indeed working in dark workshops, crowded factories, and exhausting labor systems that demanded tiny hands, long hours, and very little mercy. That is why the elves feel so eerie to modern eyes. They are labor without wages, labor without complaint, labor without the inconvenience of being socially recognized as fully human. Magic often functions as a polite cover for exploitation because saying, "the work somehow got done," sounds nicer than naming the bodies that did it. The shoemaker gets a miracle, while history usually gave the actual workers bad lungs, bent backs, and a master who still complained about productivity. 23. King Arthur usually arrives in gleaming armor with cinematic lighting, but the likely historical background behind the legend was far uglier and far less glamorous. If there was a real figure at all, he probably belonged to the chaotic world of post-Roman Britain, where central authority had collapsed, infrastructure was decaying, and local war leaders were struggling to hold territory against invasions and internal fragmentation. Early material does not present a polished fantasy monarch in a spotless court. It points more toward a military leader, a battlefield commander in a very unstable landscape. So Camelot, stripped of later romance, starts looking less like a luxury kingdom and more like a desperate emergency government with horses. The Round Table is the deluxe edition added centuries later after people got nostalgic and wanted better furniture. In reality, the age was probably mud, raids, hunger, shifting loyalties, and the kind of violence that does not leave room for polished chivalry because everybody is too busy trying not to become tomorrow's cautionary mound. 24. The Three Billy Goats. Gruff works so well because trolls under bridges are a perfect folklore shape for a very old real fear. The man who controls the crossing and makes your survival his business model. In medieval and early modern Europe, narrow passes, roads, and bridges were often tied to tolls, extortion, or armed control. And some local strongmen, or so-called robber barons, turned geography into a weapon. If you had to pass, they had leverage, and if you could not pay, negotiation had a nasty habit of becoming violence with scenery. That is why the troll feels instantly believable, even though he is green and fictional. He is just extortion wearing myth makeup. The goats are cute, but the structure of the tale is brutal. Weaker travelers confronting a stronger threat at a choke point, where fairness is not part of the business plan. The only unrealistic part is that the troll waits politely for one victim at a time instead of inventing surge pricing and calling it infrastructure management. 25. Rapunzel gets much grimmer when you line it up with the legend of Saint Barbara, whose story is one of the most chilling tower narratives in Christian tradition. According to the legend, Barbara's pagan father confined her in a tower to control her, isolate her, and keep her from influences he did not approve of, which already sounds like parenting directed by a prison architect. When she converted and refused to give up her faith, he ultimately beheaded her himself, turning paternal authority into outright slaughter. Rapunzel is not a direct copy of that story in some simple mechanical sense, but the overlap is hard to ignore. The tower, the isolated young woman, the father-shaped violence, the sense that female autonomy is treated as a threat requiring confinement. That is why tower tales hit so hard, because the prison is not abstract, it is personal. A dragon is one thing, but a parent who believes ownership and love are the same concept is a whole different genre of monster. 26. Gulliver's Travels turns especially sour when you think about the Yahoos in the context of colonial dehumanization, especially English attitudes toward the Irish. Swift's satire is broad and savage, but one reason the Yahoos bite so deeply is that they force readers to confront how ruling powers describe subjected populations: dirty, irrational, animal-like, naturally inferior, and therefore conveniently manageable. That kind of language is never innocent. Once a people can be framed as barely human, exploitation starts sounding like administration, and cruelty starts dressing up in official vocabulary. So when critics connect the Yahoos to the colonial gaze directed at the Irish, they are not just reaching for a dramatic classroom point. They are identifying one of the ugliest habits empire has ever perfected. The horror is not that the Yahoos are disgusting. The horror is how familiar the logic behind them becomes once politics enters the room. Satire works best when it reveals that civilization often needs only a small rhetorical shove before it starts behaving like a very educated barbarian. 27. The Hunchback of Notre Dame becomes even more haunting when you learn that researchers uncovered references to a real humpbacked stone carver working at Notre Dame in the early 19th century, around the same period Victor Hugo was closely connected to the cathedral's world. That does not prove Quasimodo was a direct portrait copied from life, but it does make the possibility much more unsettling and much more beautiful. Great writers rarely invent entirely from thin air. They steal glances from reality, exaggerate the silhouette, then hand it back as myth. So the thought that a real bent laborer may have been moving through the cathedral's shadows while Hugo absorbed that environment gives the novel an extra layer of sadness. Behind the bells and the gothic melodrama, there may have been an actual worker whose body had already been shaped by hardship, stone, and the social invisibility that heavy labor so often creates. Fiction made him immortal, but history probably met him first and did not bother learning his full story. 28. Mulan gets harsher the deeper you go, because the legend is not one stable story but a tradition reshaped by different periods with very different agendas about gender, loyalty, and obedience. In the earliest ballad of Mulan, she serves in place of her father, wins honor, returns home, and reveals she is a woman only after the campaign, with no immediate punishment and no theatrical public execution. But later versions grow darker and more controlling, sometimes ending in tragedy, even suicide, because later societies often admired the female warrior only right up to the moment she became too disruptive for the rules. That tells you something important about the reality underneath the legend. Even when women proved courage, skill, and loyalty, the system still kept one hand near the punishment lever. So the harsh truth is not that one clean historical case proves every hidden female soldier would be executed on the spot, but that the culture itself kept imagining female heroism as something impressive, useful, and deeply threatening all at once. 29. Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves is remembered for the cave and the phrase that opens it, but one of its most horrifying scenes is simply a piece of efficient, pre-modern slaughter involving hot oil. Morgiana discovers the thieves hidden inside jars and kills them by pouring scalding oil over them, which sounds shocking, only if you forget how comfortable old warfare and siege culture already were with fire, heat, and elaborate ways of making death unforgettable. The scene works because the audience would have recognized the logic instantly. Once the enemy is trapped, the method does not need to be polite, it just needs to be final. There is no clean duel, no noble exchange, no heroic choreography, just humans being cooked in containers because folklore never promised elegance. It is the sort of detail that survives because it is both vivid and historically plausible in a world where cruelty was often treated as a practical skill set. Magic words open the cave, but industrial-grade revenge is what keeps the audience fully awake. 30. The Bremen Town Musicians begins like a cheerful oddball comedy, then immediately reveals the grim economic logic underneath it. Each animal is old, worn out, and no longer useful enough for its owner's purposes, which means death or disposal is now the most reasonable plan on the table. The donkey is losing strength, the dog can no longer hunt properly, the cat is past its prime, and the rooster is headed for the cooking pot because apparently retirement planning in folklore was managed by a butcher. That is why the story lands, because beneath the talking animals and comic teamwork is a very hard truth about rural life. Usefulness often determined worth, and once labor value dropped, mercy had a nasty tendency to evaporate with it. The happy part is not that the world is kind. The happy part is that the abandoned create their own little alliance before the world can finish discarding them. It is basically a union formed by everyone who got told, "Thanks for your service, now please die quietly off-screen." 31. The Little Mermaid is not merely sad because she does not get the prince. It is much darker than that. In Andersen's version, mermaids do not possess an immortal soul in the human sense, and when they die, they dissolve into sea foam and vanish. That is the real horror driving the story because her longing is not just romantic, it is existential. She wants entry into a world where she might gain permanence, spiritual survival, a chance not to disappear into nothingness, which gives the whole tale a strange metaphysical panic under the surface. Later, Andersen softens the blow by introducing the Daughters of the Air, but he never fully removes the terror of non-being. The story hurts because love is tangled up with the fear that some beings may simply not count enough to endure beyond death. Disney wisely replaced that theological dread with songs, because asking children to process cosmic annihilation between catchy numbers would have been an absolutely wild creative choice. 32. Pocahontas becomes devastating the moment you stop calling her Pocahontas first and put Matoaka back at the center of her own story. She was captured by English colonists in 1613 during conflict with her people, held in captivity, pressured into conversion, baptized Rebecca, and married to John Rolfe in circumstances shaped by colonial power rather than by some glowing fairy tale romance. Then she was taken to England and displayed as living propaganda for the Virginia Company, proof that colonization was civilized, profitable, and apparently very photogenic if you ignored the kidnapping part. She died there in 1617 at around 20 or 21 years old, which turns the entire story into a brutal example of empire staging someone else's life for public relations. The real scandal is not that Disney simplified events. It is that the actual history is so blatantly tragic, coercive, and political that no amount of pastel animation could survive contact with it honestly. Colonialism never misses a chance to kidnap a person, rename her, and call the result a success story. 33. Bambi stops being just a woodland tragedy when you remember that Felix Salten, the author of the 1923 novel, was an Austrian Jewish writer and that the book was later banned and burned by the Nazis. Readers have long interpreted the novel as a broader allegory of Jewish vulnerability and persecution in Europe, and the atmosphere of the story supports that reading powerfully. The animals live in a world where death can come suddenly, arbitrarily, and from an unseen force called man, while fear, caution, and collective memory become basic tools of survival. That does not feel like simple nature writing once history enters the frame. It feels like hunted existence translated into forest language. The Nazis did not ban books because they were worried about deer feelings. They banned books because metaphors can expose systems that prefer to stay unnamed. So yes, Bambi is about loss, but it is also about what it means to live under constant threat from a world that has already decided your fear is normal background scenery. So now I want the comment section to turn into a battlefield. Which story on this list is the most disturbing one ever disguised as children's entertainment? And what fairy tale or classic did we miss that absolutely belongs here? Name it and defend it. If this video ruined your childhood in the best possible way, hit like, subscribe, and come back for more history that is way too unhinged to stay in textbooks.